Welcome to the Endless Party. I'm one of the hosts, Elijah Armstrong.
And I'm your other host, Meg Armstrong.
Our podcast is dedicated to making life a party by striving to be better people, living by good values and strong principles.
So let's jump in.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Endless Party. We are so glad you're here with us, as always.
As always, we are. Today, we are super excited to share with you one of the messages that has resonated in our hearts lately.
Struck a new chord with us.
It really did. And this message is inspired by a book that Elijah... How'd you hear from it?
So I don't even remember exactly where I heard it from, but somebody recommended that one of the greatest books of all time and that is a must-read for everybody is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And I apologize if I don't say his name right because he is German.
We think it's Frankl.
I'm American. So I hope it's Viktor Frankl, but I could be completely wrong.
Anyways, Elijah started to read this book and he was like, this book is so good, you have to read it. And so then I read it, and then of course after we read this book we were like, we have to podcast on it.
Yeah.
So clearly this episode is going to be all about man's search for meaning.
Yes.
And the way we're going to kind of organize the podcast is going to be similar in the way that the book is organized. So the first half of the book talks about Victor's experience in concentration camps, and then the second part of the book delves into meaning. And I'm going to go all into detail about, you're probably thinking now, wow, he was a concentration camp survivor? Yes, he was. So let me tell you a little bit more about
a little backstory of Viktor.
Who this guy is. So Viktor E. Frankl is most known for being a Holocaust survivor. So he spent a total of 3 years in 4 different camps. I cannot pronounce the first camp. It's like Theresienstadt, okay, Auschwitz, Kaufering 3, and Turkheim. I know I butchered those, but hopefully, I don't know. Okay, but anyways, he spent a total of 3 years in those camps. But in all reality, time in these concentration camps only represented a short period of his long life. So by the time he entered the concentration camps at 37 years old, he had already spent much of his adult life as a psychiatrist and a neurologist, and he specialized in the treatment of suicidal patients. He had also developed his own psychotherapy school called logotherapy, and the school gets its name logotherapy because the word logos is Greek for healing through meaning. So basically, as a renowned psychiatrist, he had discovered how to treat his patients by helping them to find meaning in life. Mm-hmm. Anyways, so his lasting contribution has been to the field of psychology, with his recognition of meaning as a central factor in mental health and his advocacy that the psychologist's role was to help their patients find meaning. So that's a little bit of a background on who this author is. So now we're going to kind of go into his book. So first, like I said, we're going to share, our first part is going to be all about the concentration camp and his experiences there and what we learned from that. And then our second part is going to be entitled Finding Meaning and Understanding Suffering, which is the second half of his book.
Yep.
So why don't you jump into the concentration camp?
Cool. So I think most of us are familiar with all the trauma and horrors that come from the Nazi concentration camps. And if you're not, well, that's really surprising.
It would be.
Literally the most horrific things that you could imagine occurred at these camps. And Mr. Frankl experienced every single one of them. If not firsthand, he saw friends and those that he cared about experience them. Something very, very tragic and very difficult to even handle, not only on a physical level, but also a psychological level. But it's just pretty profound how he portrays it in his book, that the book in a lot of senses is haunting because of the horrors that he delivers in them. And for example, he talks about death and how it becomes very, very commonplace in these camps, that so common that you would watch one of your friends or colleagues pass away, and then you would immediately like take his shoes or his coat because your survival was necessary, and so you would do anything it took to survive. Like I said, so it's pretty haunting, but he explains how eventually he finds meaning through all of this concentration camp, and how they continually found meaning even though they suffered such horrors and such wrongdoings. They were able to find just small and simple things that brought them joy, even amongst the greatest suffering that this world has ever seen.
Yeah, I think what's amazing about how he retells his experiences is he doesn't come across as like a victim.
No, not at all.
He more tells it as he was just like, I guess, a figure in this story.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't come across as a victim, and he shares some really interesting details that like I've never picked up from other books that I've read about the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And one of these details is in the midst of suffering, these men are tired and hungry and suffering from, so much cruelty that I don't even know how their brains like could find any sense of happiness or beauty. But he explained that men were still able to find art and humor within the camp. And he describes that it was fleeting, but there was one point where there was this gorgeous sunset outside.
Yep.
And one of the men comes into the barracks and he was like, "Hey, everyone needs to come outside, come look at this." And there was just this gorgeous sunset, and I think that's really cool. I don't know if, okay, obviously, like, none of us have suffered in the way he has, but I don't know if any of you guys have had like a super long day, but then you go out and see that sunset. And to me, it's kind of a reminder that God is there, and it kind of helps to remind you that beauty does still exist in this world no matter what experience you're going through. But I just think the fact that they were able to recognize that in such dire and horrific circumstances is just amazing.
Yeah, I would agree. Another aspect that he talked about was jokes and humor.
They would make jokes.
They found humor amongst all of this horror, right? And I think it's pretty profound. And like Meg said, none of us have experienced something as severe as the concentration camps. But I can even look back to times as a college athlete, and in no way am I comparing this to what he experienced.
No.
But not even just a college athlete, just an athlete in general, the greatest workouts that I ever had were also some of the most grueling workouts I ever had. But it was because my friends, my brother, or my teammates all made it a joke. Like we had an experience that was just fun, and we suffered together and we laughed together about it. And I think that's what's so meaningful about it, is you're able to find that humor amongst the suffering. And we actually just read another book. It's called Sea Stories.
Oh yeah.
By what's his name? McRaven.
Admiral McRaven.
Admiral
I don't remember
McRaven.
his first name.
He's now a former Navy SEAL, or I should say retired. He's not a former Navy SEAL.
He's still.
He talked about SEAL training, and I don't know if you're familiar with this, but Navy SEAL training is probably the worst physical training that you can experience, especially because you go through something called Hell Week, and it's literally 7 days of just hell. Like, that's what it is. But his experience, one experience in particular, he talks about, he was in this freezing, muddy, murky water up to his neck, and they just had to tread water for hours, and it was cold. And the advisors, they're the ones that are trying to get you to quit, but they don't want you to. They just have to go through that so they make men out of you, right? You're trying to make Navy SEALs. So they're like, as soon as somebody quits, you guys are done. And they actually all link arms together and they start singing a song. And then their advisors start yelling at them and saying, like, stop singing, or we'll make you stay in longer. And then they just start singing louder. And they got through it because they found the humor, they found the light, they found that, sunset at the end of the day. And I think that's pretty cool and pretty meaningful to me as well as each and every one of us. Like, you can always find the silver lining. You can always find the sunset at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. There is another experience that I thought was just so cool. So a lot of times when we hear the stories of concentration camps, we think a lot about the SS guards, the actual German soldiers, and we hear that they were absolutely brutal. And while in most cases this is absolutely true, what was cool is Frankl talked a lot about how, like, it wasn't just the guards who were, like, I don't know how to explain this. So in the camp, there were obviously like the prisoners, and a lot of times prisoners were, assigned to be like leaders over other prisoners, and a lot of times it was like their own people leading, like prisoners leading prisoners who gave the prisoners the most hard time, as well as the guards. Does that make sense? Can you explain that better?
In essence, not all guards were bad guys.
Yeah, okay,
and
yes.
not all prisoners were good guys.
Yeah, okay, that was perfect. Oh my god. Okay, anyways, so I bring this up because there was a day where a prison guard gave Frankl an extra piece of bread. And this happened a couple of times. And he said that it wasn't the bread that like filled his soul. It was that little moment of human kindness that filled his being, just that remembrance that, there is kindness within human beings. And I thought that was really cool too. I think that one prison guard is a hero because I'm sure he was legally bound to be doing what he was doing. And also I think it's cool too that, like, even though Frankl was absolutely starving, what his soul most longed for was kindness. Mm-hmm. And I think that's important for us to remember too, like just the importance of treating people well.
Yeah. There's actually a brief story I want to share. So this happened years and years ago, but a little boy was brought into a hospital. His family tragically died in a four-car pileup, and his parents died immediately, and so did his little sister. But he had a very little chance of survival. So when they got to the hospital, he gets admitted to this ward, and everybody in there is obviously in immense pain, as most hospitals have patients that are in immense pain. The doctors advised everybody at the ward that this little boy had one chance to survive, and that only was based on if he was left in complete darkness and complete silence. And every single one of the men in agony immediately stopped crying out in pain. So they did everything that they could to not cry out in pain. Even though that they were suffering, they bit their lips, they screamed into their pillow, whatever it was, to make sure that this little boy had absolute silence, because to them, they were giving him his only chance to live, right? And what was pretty cool is this little excerpt, I started to realize and kind of gather this understanding that human kindness often comes when chaos and crisis strike. And I'm not saying that's necessary for human kindness at all. But just to relate back to the concentration camp, this small gesture of giving a little bit of extra bread, it was like Mr. Frankl said, it wasn't the bread that actually filled his soul. It was the fact that somebody noticed that he was suffering, and they did the little bit of help that they could to try to ease some of that suffering. And I think that's incredible, and I think we all could benefit from just a little bit more kindness in this world.
I think so too. It was a cool reminder. The last thing I kind of want to talk about is the big question is, how did Frankl end up surviving? And there's a couple things. One, he explains it to be both the hand of God and sheer luck. There are a lot of different circumstances that happened to him or didn't happen to him that allowed him to survive. But I think the biggest reason why he was able to survive 3 years of suffering was that he was able to find meaning through his suffering. Meaning. And we'll explain that, because now we're going to jump into the next part of his book, where he takes his experiences in the concentration camp and uses them solely to describe how meaning and suffering, just how they can, how if you understand those two things, you can live a full and meaningful life.
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah.
So So anyways, so now we're going to share like some of our favorite quotes and findings from his logotherapy.
Mm-hmm.
So meaning, this is one of the cool things. Meaning is possible in spite of suffering, but you don't necessarily have to suffer to find meaning.
Yeah.
And this is something we really loved.
It's kind of cool because he even says suffering ceases to be suffering the moment you find meaning behind it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was pretty miraculous in that understanding. But back to what Meg was saying is meaning is possible in spite of suffering, but you do not necessarily have to suffer to find meaning. I think so many times, I don't even know how many people do this, but sometimes people think like, oh, like you have to suffer. You just have to like grit and bear it in order to find the success that you want or the meaning that you want.
Or they're like, if I suffer, then I am a hero because
Yes.
I'm suffering. I'm some heroine because I'm suffering this great thing.
And it's like, that's not true at all.
Especially if it's self-inflicted. He explains that like, if your suffering is self-inflicted, then like that's on you and you are not a hero.
No.
I don't know what you are. I don't know why you're enjoying suffering.
Yeah.
Actually, it's been a really good question for us to ask ourselves. If we start to kind of get into more of a complaining mood or, I don't know, woe is us, a lot of times I'll be like, okay, but like, is this suffering self-inflicted? Am I choosing this upon myself? And if the answer is yes, but it's unnecessary, then I immediately just try to get rid of it. But if the answer is yes, I am choosing this suffering, then I always revert back to my why. And that's kind of what we're going to jump into now. You can survive anyhow if you have a great enough why.
Yeah. I don't even remember who said that.
I don't know. Did he say that?
No.
Oh.
I mean, maybe he said it too, just in a different way. But anyways, not important. It's pretty miraculous because I even look at it in my own life. I think we've talked about this briefly in other podcasts, and you can survive anyhow if you have a great enough why. And currently, actually, the Olympic trials are going on.
Yes.
And incredible athletes all around the United States come together to battle to see who the top 3 will go to the Olympics. And it's been incredible and just inspiring to watch some of these athletes. But what's insane is you don't see the past 4 years that the athletes went through in order to get to this one race.
Nope.
And I'm speaking about track and field, right? Because that's the sport me and Meg love dearly. Anyways, they can endure countless hours of pain, suffering, work, miles and miles of running.
Discipline, missing out on events.
All of it, right? Because their why is strong enough. Like, you can endure anyhow if your why is strong enough. And that's why. Their why is Olympics. Their why is Olympian. Their why is gold medal. And all that suffering is nothing in comparison with that gold medal at the end of the day. And I think that's incredible. And that's really what this meaning is. And I use the sports analogy, but there's also greater whys than just sports or a gold medal, right? So for me, it's my wife and my children, my 2 little girls, or the things that we do, like this podcast, and just the meaning that we find within the things that we enjoy doing.
So in the case of Frankl, he was able to live because he decided that he was going to continue to author his book and work on his school of logotherapy. So within the camp, he decided that his suffering was going to be used for the purpose of creating this book and helping others to find meaning in spite of suffering. Mm-hmm. And so that's why he made it. So it was also interesting too, because in the camp, it was obvious when a prisoner was about to give up, because they sought out pleasure. So Viktor came to understand that like when he saw a prisoner giving up and smoking one of their last cigarettes, he knew that these people were going to lose the will to live because they became hopeless creatures. And what happened was they let go of their why, and instead they just sought out like little small moments of pleasure to try to, escape their suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't work.
No, never does.
And I bring that up too because I think sometimes, like, in life, I think we can be tempted by things that have small moments of pleasure, maybe the pleasure of buying that new car, or the pleasure of going out with friends, or the pleasure of, going out with friends isn't bad, but like, do you know what I'm trying to say? Like, doing small things that make you feel better in the moment, but then, like, they don't actually help, like, your situation out at all.
Well, we actually just did a podcast on this too, and it's, I like what money can buy, but I love what money can't buy, right? And the reason I bring this up is everything that money can buy is fleeting. Money can buy a lot of things, and they're great, and I'm not dissing that at all. But everything that money can't buy is lasting.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, the relationship that I have with my wife, I didn't pay for it. I didn't buy it. I didn't purchase it. And that's why it's lasting. And so that's what he's talking about. Like a cigarette, the high that you get from the nicotine is not lasting. It fades away. And it's no different in life. And I think what was so cool about this is that he talks about it within the frameworks of this concentration camp, but it carries over into his therapy because he relates it to everyday life. That when we seek pleasure instead of happiness, we start to really actually suffer in misery.
Mm-hmm.
Because everything that we are seeking is fleeting.
Yes. The next thing I want to talk about, we're going to shout out my friend Riley, because she talked to us about this last week, and I thought it was so cool. So, the world has expectations, but Christ fosters hope. And it's hope that can fulfill us. So, for example, within the concentration camp, there were prisoners who expected to be out of camp by Christmas. And when the war wasn't over by Christmas, like, the death toll from Christmas to New Year's was the highest it had been in the camp the whole year, because of their dashed expectations. Because, like,
their hope left.
Their hope left because they expected to be home instead of, like, hoping to be freed, eventually. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I think that what it was is that these prisoners did expect to be home by Christmas, but in all reality, when that didn't transpire, they had no more desire to live because they couldn't see the end. Mm-hmm. Because in their mind, they already had the end in place. But when it didn't transpire that way, they just died. In essence, it did transpire that way. They were out by Christmas. They just died instead.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is really sad. But I think too, like, in my life, sometimes I feel like I set unrealistic expectations of how, certain days are going to go, or what I think my life needs to look at. And instead, I want to, like, get rid of my expectations and instead just have hope in Christ and, like, peace that he's taking care of my life and things are going to be okay. Anyways, I thought that was kind of a cool thought.
Yeah.
So, like we kind of talked about earlier, even amongst their suffering, they were still able to find beauty and humor within the camp. So, Viktor Frankl, after his experience in the concentration camp, he explains that a Jewish rabbi came in and was suffering because of the death of his wife. And Viktor just goes, I can't bring your wife back, but he was able to change the man's attitude. And he helped this man discover new meaning. And so for this rabbi who lost his wife, he goes, are you the man that she deserves later? And would you rather have her die and you suffer, or would you rather die and have her suffer, right? And and then, even though this man was, like, pent up with anger and frustration and suffering that his wife had died, because Viktor gave him a new meaning and a new perspective, he just calmly walked out of the office and had a really good attitude about the death of his wife. And there's something that Elijah and I repeat to ourselves all the time, and it's that attitudes are more important than facts. Mm-hmm. And no matter what your situation looks like, you can adopt a different attitude and, quite frankly, change your situation because of how you just look at it.
Oh, I would agree. I think it's pretty miraculous how so many people can have a completely different perspective. I mean, there's a old saying, and it's a little corny, but it's like, you can either cry in the storm or dance in the rain.
Oh yeah.
And really, that's the reality of every situation in life. Like, there's always a silver lining, and you can always find it, but it's up to you to find it. It's our attitudes that determine. There's another quote too, now that I think about it. Our attitude determines our altitude.
Another quote we really enjoyed by Mr. Frankl reads, "Thus suffering completely fills the human soul and conscious mind, no matter whether the suffering is great or little. Therefore, the size of human suffering is absolutely relative." We liked this quote because sometimes I think too in our heads we can be like, well, my suffering isn't that bad because someone has it worse. But what's crazy is Viktor Frankl suffered like one of the worst forms of human suffering, but he still expresses that suffering is relative to the human mind and circumstance. And I'm like, that's cool.
I agree. So, to give you a little bit of an example, when I ran at BYU, there was this famous workout called the Michigan, and it was a nightmare. It was a really grueling workout, just a really tough workout. And I remember on one occasion our coach telling us that we're going to do the Michigan, and we were prepping for like a week in advance. Get to the day that we're supposed to do the Michigan, and then he tells us we're actually just going to do a 6-mile tempo run, which was still grueling, but it wasn't nearly as bad as the Michigan. And because of that, we were all elated that we only had to do a tempo run of 6 miles instead of the Michigan. And so it was kind of interesting because as soon as we read this quote by Mr. Frankl, I understood what he means, that suffering is absolutely relative. Like, some suffering is by far worse than other suffering, and because you've endured certain things, you're able to endure harder things at times. Mm-hmm. You know, it was actually interesting because Meg, after she had these 2 little angels of ours, and she had an emergency C-section and everything that she experienced, she was like, I'm gonna be honest.
Life's not that bad.
And she's like, life's not that bad. And exercising is easier to her, lifting weights is easier to her. No matter what she endures, she's like, this isn't as bad as being pregnant with twins and having an emergency C-section.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
That's why suffering is absolutely relative, and it varies from person to person. So, for example, to give you another example, somebody that grew up in my family, there were certain aspects that we would call suffering because there were certain requirements of the boys, just, blue collar kids, hard manual labor every day. Our dad owned a landscaping business, but also we were required to wrestle, and that entailed running every morning and just different aspects. Then, on the flip side, you take it to a kid who grew up in a rich household, that it was a white-collar family. His suffering is going to be so much different to the suffering that I experienced. Yeah. And so that's why it's absolutely relative depending on the person.
I think, too, because it's relative, I think we can all be a little bit more compassionate about what people are going through. And just because something might not appear to be hard to you doesn't mean it's not hard to somebody else.
Right.
And we can just respect the fact that everybody in some sense of life is suffering, and so we can just
be a little sympathetic.
Be nice.
Yeah, be a little sympathetic to the sorrows and struggles of others.
Yeah. So all of that was about what Viktor had to say about suffering, and now we're going to go into my favorite part of this podcast, and it's going to be all about meaning. What is man's search for meaning? Well, let me tell you. We're going to start with one of Viktor's quotes, and I thought this was kind of cool. So he goes, "We must never forget that we may also find meaning in life even when confronted with a hopeless situation, when facing a fate that cannot be changed. For what then matters is to bear witness to the uniquely human potential at its best, which is to transform a personal tragedy into a triumph, to turn one's predicament into a human achievement. When we are no longer able to change a situation, just think of an incurable disease such as an inoperable cancer. We are challenged to change ourselves. So, Elijah and I, we got married, and then we both of our running was ended. Not tragically, that sounds dramatic, but it wasn't in our hands why our running careers ended. And we kind of had this, it wasn't really a rut, but we had this, portion of our lives where we were like, well, what are we going to do next? How are we going to find meaning in what we're doing? And so we moved, and that proved to be really hard too, and didn't quite give us what we were looking for. And for a little while there, we were just kind of like, woe is us, this is a tragedy, like, what are we going to do about this situation? But what's so amazing is I think what we've chosen to do with our life is a testament to this quote where it's like, okay, well, it appears that every outside force is against us, but I can still change myself, and I can still determine what my destiny is and how I'm going to make this situation a triumph instead of something that's super negative.
No, I would agree. It's interesting because as she was talking about that, with both of our running careers being ended in a less than triumphant way, we did really have to figure out who we were outside of running, and it was interesting because we did have to change ourselves.
Yeah.
Right? So we found ourselves in this new environment, and it was kind of this rut we were in, but then we came to this understanding and this conclusion that nothing in life is going to change. Our lot is still the same lot that we were given, but what we can do is we can change ourselves. And I think that was the greatest one of the greatest aspects about human life is the fact that nothing is permanent so long as you are willing to change.
I just always want to accept the challenge to change. Like, I just have changed my mindset towards suffering and adversity, and when I feel that something challenging is coming or happens, I try to get actually a little bit excited for it, and I try to turn it into something that's like, okay, well, I have this golden opportunity to learn something new, become someone different in a good way. And so that's what I try to do. And it's been really beneficial to me.
It's actually kind of interesting. So Mr. Frankl has this quote too. He says, "Man is that being who invented the gas chambers at..."
Auschwitz.
Okay, let's start over. "Man is that being who invented the gas chambers at Auschwitz. However, he is also that being who entered those gas chambers upright with the Lord's Prayer on his lips." And I think that's profound because within this life, we have people like Stalin and Hitler. But on the flip side, we also have people like Winston Churchill, Abraham Lincoln, and Nelson Mandela. And it's all up to us to determine who we become based on our choices. And what's so cool is, crazy, is Stalin and Hitler found meaning, a very sick and twisted meaning, but Nelson Mandela found meaning. And we can find that same meaning, something profound, something that can benefit life, something that can benefit humanity as a whole. And it's really just up to us to make that decision for ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. One of the last quotes, oh, no, we have two more. But I actually wanted you to share this one because this is one you really liked.
Oh yeah, so we've all heard many different phrases as terms of how we should live. And for example, it's like, treat others the way that you want to be treated, or live each day in a day-tight compartment, or live every moment as if it is your last. So Mr. Frankl has this, and this is the epitome of his logotherapy. And he says, "Live as if you were living already for the second time, and as if you have acted the first time as wrongly as you are about to act now." Which is pretty cool.
I think it's super cool.
It's really cool because it puts into perspective that you actually have the choice to change right now. Like, you do not have to commit something that's wrong. You do not have to say something cruel or mean to somebody else. You have it within yourself to change immediately.
I think it's beautiful. I really like that one. Okay, so we've been talking about meaning, but I wonder if some of you are thinking, well, how do I find meaning? Well, we're going to give you some ideas that he shared. So life has its own meaning for everybody, but it is up to you to find it.
Yeah,
and Frankl
varies
says,
from person to person.
Yeah, Frankl says the meaning of life differs from man to man, from day to day, and from hour to hour. What matters, therefore, is not the meaning of life in general, but rather the specific meaning of a person's life at a given moment. And I think this is so cool because we find meaning by answering for our own life. For example, this is something like, at this point in my life, a lot of my meaning comes from being a young baby mom. I love to take care of my babies, and from hour to hour and day to day, that's what encompasses a huge portion of my life. I take care of my babies, and that's great. But in 18 years from now, they're not going to be in our house anymore, and I'm still going to be their mom, but it's going to be I'm going to be a different kind of mother, and my meaning is going to change.
Right.
And how I parent our babies because circumstances change. And I think that's really cool because sometimes I think we live in absolutes where it's like this, the whole meaning of my life is this, but we don't recognize that it's okay for the meaning of your life to change in your different circumstances and situations and different eras.
Well, for example, I think most of us are told our entire life, it's like work one job your whole life after you graduate college and then retire young. And then what? What do you do after that? And I think that's where people kind of struggle, is a lot of people retire and then they're like, what do I do now?
Yeah.
And they pick up random hobbies, which is great, and if that's what you want to do, awesome. But it's pretty profound because I was speaking to a guy who's in his 70s, very, very wealthy individual, and I was talking to him about one of our family friends who retired, and he was like, how old is he? And I was like, oh, he's about 60. And he's like, that's way too young to retire. It's like, what? He's like, I never want to retire. Mind you, this guy is in his 70s. He's like, I love what I do. I have a passion for what I do. Like, why would I ever throw away what I believe is my purpose in life? And I think that's what's so cool about what Meg is speaking about is she's already developing the meaning of her life. One, the kids are just a major, major bonus, and they by far are a huge meaning in our life.
Yeah.
They bring us purpose, they bring us value. But what's cool is that each and every one of us can find more meaning outside of just our family or even our spouses. And he even talks about that. He says there's 3 ways we can find meaning. First, by creating a work or doing a deed. Second, by experiencing something or encountering someone. And third, by the attitude we take toward unavoidable suffering. And I think it's just so really profound within life is that we can all create our own meaning based on many different things. There's not just one end-all be-all in order for us to find the meaning and purpose of our own individual lives.
I love that.
Yeah.
Really, I do. We have a couple more quotes we want to share, and then we'll wrap this podcast out. The first thing, Elijah's going to share this poem that he loves.
I'm sure all of you have heard it. It's Invictus by William Ernest Henley, and I'm just going to read it for you. It says, out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. And I love this because it directly applies to really what Viktor Frankl went through, is that he went through absolute hell, to put it frank, and yet his head was bloody but unbowed, and he still every day found meaning and purpose even though he was going through absolute misery. And because of that, he truly found that he was the master of his fate and the captain of his soul.
And he did that because he went on to write this book and help thousands of other people find meaning in theirs.
Millions.
Probably millions.
This book has sold over 20 million copies.
Oh wow, okay. Millions of
people.
The last thought we wanted to end with is this is something that Elijah repeats to our daughters daily.
Every day.
And they look up at him and they smile, and it's a really cute little thing.
So Ella Wheeler Wilcox wrote this small poem, and this is just an excerpt of it, but it says, "There's no chance, no destiny, no fate that can circumvent or hinder or control the firm resolve of a determined soul."
I think we'll leave you with that.
I think so too.
Put your mind to finding meaning and live up to it, and your life will change for the better.
Find the meaning in your own life.
You can.
Absolutely. So, to just end off, thank you so much for listening.
Yes.
We really appreciate you being here. Until next time, find that meaning and purpose of your own life. And reach out, ask us questions if you have any. We'd love to answer them.
We always would.
Absolutely.
All right.
Peace.